I have to say. So I'm going to talk about pragmatic observations across cultures. And I'm going to sort of gear this toward an undergraduate level. So please don't feel insulted if I say something that you already know. I assume that there'll be others who see this afterward. So let's just sort of talk, what are pragmatics, okay? Because I read the article that Professor Leo had sent me, and she said it was theoretical, and I kept thinking, giddy up, cowboy, right? Give me more examples, right? So that's what I hope to do is provide you with some real concrete life situations that you can share with your friends at the coffee shop or the bar, but will hopefully also be things that you can use or reflect on as you try to master your intercultural competence. So just to insult everyone's intelligence, I'm just going to quickly read the definition I found for pragmatics is the branch of linguistics dealing with language in use and the context in which it is used, including such matters as deixis, the taking of turns in conversation, text organization, presupposition, and implicature. So what does that mean? Translation is communication beyond just words. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about today. And for those of you from the STEM fields who are more mathematically or computer literate, it's words plus social and cultural considerations. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, just simple examples are, when should I talk or not talk? What topics should I include or avoid? How formal or informal should my language be? How explicit is too explicit? How close should I sit or stand? What is communicated through the eyes? What is communicated through different kinds of smiles? What is communicated through gestures? And how should my thoughts be arranged or organized? Okay, so these are things that are not necessarily taught in an introductory foreign language class as we're trying to teach phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, right? Just get those words out there, right? So one of the things I do as a researcher is I look at people who are bicultural or multicultural, and I try to make sense of who they are and try to have them make sense of who they are themselves. So one of the exercises I often give is to ask someone to provide a picture that would depict their identity, right? And sometimes they're very simple. They're Venn diagrams saying, this is my Japanese side, this is my American side, and there's some intersection, right? Sometimes they get more creative, like this young lady over here on the left says, my family's Chaldean, and they're pulling me back, and I want to be part of this American culture, but I can't, and I'm reaching for it, and so on. Other people, look at things being, I'm Japanese, but I have this American blocks building upon a Japanese block, and then I sort of, veer off into these different ideas, right? So there's so many ways to depict your identity. And I don't mean to make this, this presentation about myself, but as a point of departure, I thought that finally I would take this assignment myself, okay, and try to create this exercise. So this is what I have come up with is looking at myself. I'm from a very Anglo-American background, meaning that emotionally we keep things in check. There's no crying at funerals. There's no, open embracing or verbal affection, I love you, right? As those are done sort of sparingly. And so I'm sort of coming from this background where that's kind of considered a good to keep yourself in check. And we laugh at people who are so emotional and so on and so forth. But that's a cultural bias, right? As I went to Spain, I found that I became a little bit more open, and maybe Michael can identify with this, but you can say things that you might not say in English. So I'm a little bit more outgoing, a little bit more emphatic, sometimes because you have to be. And this is probably more true of Spain than Mexico and in a lot of Latin America, okay? Next, I went to Japan. So on the one hand, you might think, well, the Japanese are formal and so on and so forth. And that's true. I did have to be a lot more closed and a lot more cognizant of people who are older and, of higher prestige. But on the other hand, I became the opposite way. So when I'm older than somebody, when I'm in a position of higher prestige, I'm actually more outgoing and more emphatic and more direct than I ever would be in English or in Spanish. And also, if you have a close relationship with someone in Japan, and applies somewhat to China, there's less filter, right? I'm sure that Professor Liu would agree that you don't just say thank you and please to your spouse, because that would be kind of weird, right? It would take away from the intimacy. For an American adjusting to something like that, it's almost like, whoa, it's too much, right? That people express themselves very, very freely when they're close to you, right? So I'm used to sort of that, dichotomy of culture that, you change very much according to the person that you're speaking with, right? And being part of Japan, or being in Japan, made me very aware of those differences between myself and whoever I'm speaking to. And then finally, to a much lesser extent, I started taking Chinese not in 1987, but more like 2007, when I was old, and when I was already old. And I have this small Chinese part of my personality as well, which is nowhere near as extreme as the Japanese side, but there's some difference in terms of how I will relate to the people that I'm speaking with. Okay, so I'm saying this not just to talk about myself, but to provide you with a point of departure about some of the things that I'm going to tell you. Okay, first, let's take a trip to Britain. Okay, and this is something that came to my attention as I was in England in 2004, and I was studying higher educational administration, and I was sitting in a pub with a fellow British student who made some things very clear to me that somehow I was never able to articulate. Okay, in Britain, the idea is to keep everything to a 5, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, you don't want to veer off that very sort of controlled, emotional state a desirable emotional state. So for example, if I want to say, I love you, okay, it's very difficult for British people and people of British descent to look someone straight in the eye and say, I love you, right? I can express that by changing the tone of my voice, right? And I can say, I love you. I can say it in a very sarcastic way, and that sort of keeps things in check. And if I'm angry, conversely, I'm not likely to scream at someone, I hate you, right? I might look at you and give you a look, a side glance, say, I hate you. And it's a little ambiguous. It's never completely clear whether I love you or I hate you, right? Because that would just be stepping out of my bounds. It would be just too embarrassing, because you might not say, I love you back, right? But if I couch it with, I love you, then it's okay, right? I'm comfortable with that. I save face, I can walk out of it, right? So there's always this way of expressing even your deepest affection by couching it in the way you present the words that you want to present. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about England for right now. Let's take a trip to Spain. Okay, this I think is interesting. In Spanish, I find that you have to say things 3 times, right? I remember making an observation when I was in Spain that it's really the great thing about learning Spanish, at least in Spain, I think most of the Spanish-speaking world, is that people will repeat themselves a lot, and they're happy to do it. They're happy to take the floor and tell you the same story about being overcharged at the grocery store, and they will tell you a second time, and the third time their hands will be in the air and say, can you believe that they overcharged me? This is incredible. And I thought, well, great. I didn't understand it the first time. I got it a little bit more the second time. And the third time, I totally understood what that person said. I said, this is great for a language learner. And I expressed this to a friend of mine who is Puerto Rican and who was teaching cross-cultural seminars. And she said, well, that's because in the Spanish-speaking world, no one is going to believe what you say if you just say it once, right? For example, I can say, this is a really great mug. This is, by the way, Wayne State Engineering. So this is a really great mug. And you say, okay, but if it were in Spanish, I've had a lot of mugs, and this is an amazing, amazing mug. I mean, the lip of this is incredible. I like the heft and so on. And then I would say something again. And by the end of that, exhortation, you might say, oh, that really is a good mug. I'll go out and buy it myself, right? So there's this crazy emphasis, whereas an American would say, well, I heard you the third time. I heard you the first time. You know, there's no need to continue explaining this, right? So the first thing is the 3 times rule in Spanish. Also, Spanish speakers are fond of the more passive constructions, right? So in English, everything is I, right? I'm happy. I think this is great. I think it's annoying. I like, I want, right? But in Spanish, there's this idea of me gusta. Something is pleasing to me, right? I'm just happen to be there. It's something else happens to be the agent or the topic, right? This interests me as opposed to I'm interested in, right? I have 3 pieces of chocolate left as opposed to 3 chocolates remain for me, right? So there's all of these passive constructions, and there's a predilection and a preference toward using these passive constructions. It's not all about I. Okay, and that, bearing that in mind, I love the fact that Spaniards and Spanish-speaking people avoid personal culpability, right? It's never your fault in Spain, right? So you don't lose your keys. I mean, I can translate perdí las llaves, right? But I would never say that in Spanish, because why would I, why would I implicate myself? I would say, se me perdieron las llaves. The keys got lost and I was there, right? Also, I don't forget anything in Spanish. I never say olvidé, like, no, I say, se me olvidó. It was forgotten, right? I mean, I'm part of this equation, but it's a much lesser so. And so it left me, se fue, it left me, se me escapó, it escaped me, right? But I'm not the one who's at fault, okay? So a little different way of thinking in the Spanish. Another thing is to be more emphatic, right? There are things that I would say in Spanish with my hands in the air that I would never say in English, right? Like really? Are you crazy? Are you get out of here? Like, que va, right? You would say, no me digas, don't tell me, right? That's just a little bit more than I would say, really, in English, right? What else do we have? Things like, oh, por Dios, right? Oh, my, when we consider it swearing to use God, right? Or to use Jesus, but in Spanish, Jesús is common, right? And when you finish a story, at least in Spain, and Michael, maybe you've seen this before, the hand goes up, right? It goes like, let me see, like, ya está, right? Ya está, right? And that's the end of the story, right? It's almost always that way. And of course, there are a lot of gestures like mucha gente, many people, and so on. It's almost like you couldn't get a Spaniard to say many people if you tied their hands behind their back, because they always have to say mucha gente, right? So more emphatic when you're speaking Spanish. Another thing I thought was interesting is that you have a lot of expressions that are based in religion, right? So you can say, es tan bueno como el pan, right? He's as good as bread. And Americans would say, well, bread's not very expensive. Why would you say? We say he's as good as gold, right? Or you say, son los dos hacen buenas migas, right? They're good crumbs. Well, if you call someone a crumb in English, it means they're worthless, right? But in Spanish, calling someone as good as bread refers to the body of Christ, which is represented by bread in Holy Communion, right? So being as good as bread is being, almost godlike, and being buenas migas are being 2 crumbs from that bread, meaning that you are close friends, right? Also, the word companion, compañero, comes from con, which is with, pan is bread. So the person with whom you break bread is your companion, right? And likewise, the word ojalá, which comes from inshallah in Arabic, is sort of God willing, right? So there's a lot of these religious based expressions in Spanish that come from the Catholic religion. Compare that with English, right? Which is called the language of finance, right? Everything we have has to do with values. So we have, he's as good as gold, not he's as good as bread, right? I feel like $1 million, right? Everything is money, money, money. And he has a heart of gold, right? It's worth it. It's not worth it. We're always thinking in terms of finance in the Anglo-Saxon mind, okay? Another side of Spain is, I thought was just interesting and possibly worth saying, is that there is a lot of swearing going on in Spain, especially in rural Castilian areas. I mean, they say things and put things together that had never, ever crossed my mind. And so you will hear a fair amount of just bad language. And the Spaniards, I think, have this reputation throughout the rest of Latin America as being kind of blasphemous and just, you know, devil may care with the types of words that they use. They will call the Spaniards groseros, right? They use just really, you know, strong language. But I thought that was a very interesting aspect of Spanish culture. Another thing, and this is a story that I need to relate to you. When I was in Spain, my senior year, and I was in Seville, in Sevilla, I wrote an essay that I thought was great. Okay, it was on the book The Niebla, and I had written it in a way that, you know, I had a thesis sentence and I had all these great supporting ideas, and it just flowed the way an essay should go. And I had done fine in all of my classes in the US, but also I had professors who spoke English as well as Spanish. Well, I handed this essay in, got it back, and I got a C, and I was devastated. I couldn't believe it. Like, what is wrong with this? I took it back home, and my roommate was raised by a Mexican father and a Spanish mother in Santa Barbara. So his English was perfect. His Spanish was perfect. I said, read this, tell me what you think. Is it really worth a C? And he read it and he said, you know what? He said, when I read this with my English brain, it makes perfect sense. When I read it with my Spanish brain, I want more. I want you to tell me that is to say that, es decir que, and then just go off and then come back, and then go off and come back. And so I did that for my next paper using es decir que, that is to say that, and it was almost, to my mind, satirical in the way that I was writing it. And I got an A, okay? Because that is the mindset that you have when you are writing and reading Spanish. You need more and more explications than you would in English, okay? And so I think these diagrams that have long since been created, long before I was born, make a lot of sense, right? That the English really is very linear. Anything outside is superfluous. But in Spanish, no. Keep it all in, explain it. Let's take a trip to Japan here. Okay, Japanese modesty. This is always interesting. Never brag about yourself, okay? We can understand that, but you have to be really careful about your P's and Q's. You never say, I'm pretty good at that, I can do this. No, that's out. Not only that, never boast about family, friends, or in-group members. It is not appropriate in Spanish to say, you know, my father was an accountant. I'm really proud of him. I think he did really well in his, you know, in his career. Like, what is wrong with you? How immodest can you be? I would not say, my friend Michael here, he speaks Spanish really well. They'd look at you and say, what? You're telling me about your in-group? Unacceptable, right? They would just look at you with a really strange smile. Deflect all compliments. If somebody says, Megan, you speak Chinese really well. You know, of course, nali, right? In Japanese, you would never say thank you, right? I mean, there's some younger people who are starting to say it, but it's by and large considered inappropriate. You deflect all of your compliments. No, sono koto wa nai. Nothing like that, right? And if you're a woman, sorry if this is sexist, you cover your mouth when you laugh, right? It was considered, in fact, women in older Japan would blacken their teeth because that was, you know, considered something you didn't show the outside world after you had been married, okay? Japanese, like Spanish, is also very passive, right? You need to get to use these things like it was eaten, it was worn, so on and so forth. And I will admit that my Japanese is at a place where I know that I use the active voice far too often. So that next step for me in Japanese would be to get really geared into using that, you know, rareru form, like taberaremashita, it was eaten, so on and so forth, right? This thing is really interesting. This took a few years before I really understood it in Japan. And this is the Japanese bitter smile, right? Nigawarai. So you can see this guy's smile, right? It's not just like a smile of pure joy or ecstasy, right? This is the face your boss gives you when you ask for a raise and he doesn't want to give you a raise, right? A woman might give you this smile if you ask her out and she doesn't want to go out with you, right? So it has its various purposes. Just by way of example, I will tell you that when I was in my early 20s, I was in Japan, and this is tell you what an instigator that I am. I was at a table with a group of Japanese and a group of Americans. And I said to my American friends, I said, watch, I'm going to ask Ri-chan, Japanese woman, an impossible proposition, and she will not say no. So I asked her in Japanese, I said, Ri-chan, do you want to go to Mount Fuji with me this weekend? And she said in Japanese, I'd like to, but I said, no, I don't understand. Like, ikitai desu ka? Ikitakunai desu ka? Do you want to go? Do you not want to go? I said, I want to go, but I said, no, that's not good enough. I want to know. Tell me right out. I don't understand. Do you want to go or not? I want to go, but I could not get her to say, I don't want to go, right? So there's this idea that look at my eyes, look at my smile. I am telling you no. Are you an idiot, right? So even the yes means no. And this is something a lot of Americans don't understand. They believe that they have a deal with a Japanese company, for example, and they think because somebody said, I understand, or we understand each other, they think they have a deal. But the fact is, until something's in writing, it's not a deal. Okay. Here's another smile I enjoyed in Japan. This is another smile that somebody will give you when they probably disagree vehemently, right? But they will not say wrong or contradict you. They will just sort of look like they're tolerating you to some extent, okay? So the Japanese smile and the eyes often tell you far more than the language ever will. Okay, something about Japanese greetings, okay? I always say that the Japanese are content to choreograph their entire lives, right? And the cliche, rather than being cliche, is something that is admired, and it's something that's very intricate, and a well-educated, well-bred person knows what to say in what situations. And there are volumes of books called Nihongo notes, which tell foreigners about all the little traps that we can fall into, right? Like if you say when someone's mother died, I'm sorry, they look at you and say, why, did you kill her, right? So you say, oh, that must be difficult, taihen desu ne, right? It must be so on. So there are certain things that you say at certain times, and they're not cliche, they're expected. Before you eat, you say, itadakimasu, I gratefully partake. And at the end of your meal, you say, gochisou-sama deshita, right? Expected. If you don't, you are poorly educated, right? You are poorly bred. When you arrive home like this little bear, you say tadaima always. You don't just walk into a house, you announce tadaima, and somebody says okaeri nasai, right? Welcome. That's expected. When you're leaving, you say itekimasu or itemairimasu, and then somebody will always say itarashai, go and come back, right? These things are expected. They're considered, niceties and so on, right? Even bowing, look at this. They show you how much you should bow depending on who you are meeting, right? Whether it's somebody who's lower than you, who's the same, somebody who's higher than you will bow accordingly. There are so many intricacies in Japan that everything I did for 2 years was wrong. And I had to learn from my mistakes. I would put for example, when you walk into a house, you take your shoes off, you put them in a box, you put on some slippers that are there for you, walk to a tatami room, you take the slippers off, leave the tatami room, put the slippers on, walk toward the bathroom, must take the slippers off and put on the wooden clogs, leave the bathroom, take the wooden clogs off, put the slippers on, go to the tatami room, take the slippers off, walk in your socks, walk to the foyer, you put the slippers back on, and then you take the slippers off and you put them into the box, and then you put your slippers on, and then you bow toward your host and you say, thank you, thank you, thank you, as you exit walking backwards in every home in Japan. I made every one of those mistakes. I walked out of the bathroom with the wooden clogs. I walked into the tatami room with the slippers on. I walked into the house with my street shoes. walked out of the house with I mean, every one of those things I did. And the only face that I saw in Japan for the first 2 years was, right? Because I was a mistake incarnate, okay? Here are just a few movies that I would recommend, especially by this one director, Itami Juzo, or Juzo Itami. And they are wonderfully satirical about Japanese society, and basically get at the idea that the Japanese are trying to be so perfect in how they deal with making soup, or how they conduct a funeral, or so on, that they inevitably make just incredible mistakes and things just get out of hand and so on. So if you really want to kind of understand Japanese culture, I highly recommend these movies, which are generally of a satirical nature. Okay. Let's talk about power distance. This is one of Geert Hofstede's original values, or cultural value difference. And oops, where did this go? So power distance is the degree that differences in power are accepted. So with that in mind, these are the two extremes of Japanese society. There is the phys ed teacher, and there is the elevator girl. Okay, and these are basically direct translations. In Japanese is erebe tagaru, right, from English, and the taekwondo sensei, the PE teacher. And I'll mention that there was a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, written by Ruth Benedict in, I think, 1947. And I think she really had her thumb on the pulse of Japanese society, because it does take on two extremes, right, of being extremely, on the left side, very informal and direct and condescending and powerful, and on the right being so just elevated and polite and distant and formal and ethereal and so on and so forth. And so when I make this these scales, this 1 through 10, you'll notice that I keep the American flag kind of in the middle, right? Because the way I treat my boss and the way that I treat my student is really not that different. I don't change my my language very much. I'm pretty much on the same. Whereas the phys ed teacher will be saying things to the students like, "Well, you're sloppy, aren't you? Fix your necktie, right? Get over here. Did you finish mopping the floor? Mop the floor," right? It's not even, "Would you mind mopping the floor," right? It's mop the floor. The elevator girl is sort of like, "May I gratefully partake in, moving you to the next floor?" And it's just this very elevated speech that I just found hilarious, and usually in a very high voice, right? I'm not sure how many elevator girls there are left, but my gosh, in the 80s, they were just a great source of entertainment for me. I'm going to provide a little short story just to give you an idea of some of the cultural differences. I had a vice principal of the school where I taught. He had been a retired principal from somewhere else, and I really respected him. I mean, to the point where I dedicated my dissertation to him. But I was a young teacher, and as you can see, I was once young. This is a picture of me about 125 years ago in the 1980s. And so at that point, he said, he was teaching English, and he said, "I'd like you to sit in on my English class and let me know what you think." He goes, "Because unlike a lot of Japanese teachers, I teach my class fully in English, and I'd really like your feedback." I said, "Well, I would be honored to do that." And so I sat in the back of the class, and he walks into the classroom. And of course, they have the normal ritual where everybody has to stand up and then bow and then sit down. And he snaps his fingers and he says, "You, Yamaguchi, read page 12. And Yamaguchi, he goes, "Stand up," right? He stands up and he says something and he mispronounces something. And then the teacher goes, "Wrong, not like that, like this." And then he goes, "You, Noguchi, up." And it went on, right? It was just this very strong, commanding performance. And afterward, he said, "Well, what did you think of my class?" And I said, "Well, I think it's great, that you're teaching in English." I said, "But I have to tell you that if you wanted to teach the way an American teacher would, you would say, Mr. Noguchi, would you please stand up and would you mind reading page 12? And he said, "Mister?" He said, "Please?" To a student? This was just sort of blew his 72-year-old mind, right? That you would actually say something politely, right? And so the next day he went back to his class and he said, I talked to Mr. Brender, and he had suggested that I teach this class the way an American teacher would. And so Mr. Noguchi, would you please read page 12? And all of the students snickered and they said, I can't believe he's asking me, he's saying please, and he's doing this politely. This is just so, so out of character in Japan. So, to his credit, 72 years old, and he changed his ways and did those kinds of things. So, so just an example of that power distance and the authority. Young teachers in Japan will sometimes be too polite and the students will not respect them for it. So just a couple of things in terms of power distance, the Japanese pronouns. How many different ways do we have to say I in English, right? Say, I have to do my homework, change I to something else. Unless you're Tarzan, me have to do my homework, right? There's only one pronoun, and I like you. Can you substitute you? If you're a Quaker, I like thou, right? Or something, but generally we have one pronoun for first person singular and one person for second. But in Japanese, if I'm being formal, I can use watakushi, right? If I'm a guy and I'm kind of informal, I can say boku wa amerikajin da yo. Ore would be in the judo room or something like that. And among young kids, so on, like, ora, it's very, very strong. And the same with the second person. Very often they will use your name and with a title, like Ryo sensei, something like that. Kimi would be for a younger woman. Omae, I love, is for younger men, is usually, in the sports team, it's like, omae, right? Anta is even better. That's what your wife calls you when she's really mad. So there are so many more of these. And historically, I think between 30 and 50 of different pronouns for first and second person. So you can see that it's embedded into the entire Japanese language. Likewise, verbs, if I'm going to say, write, well, I can't just translate write. It's like, I wrote a letter to her. Well, is she higher or lower in status than I am, right? He wrote a letter to me. Well, I have to know, is that person higher or lower status? Is it honorific? Is it so many consideration when you translate into Japanese? Likewise, there are these honorifics using goshujin, your husband. The go shows this honorific. We rarely have them in English, and even words like Mr. and Ms. or doctor can be ignored, right? A lot of people will just come into my office and instead of saying Professor Brender, Dr. Brender, hey, John, what's up? And a lot of people are very cool with that type of thing, right? And then the American Constitution forbids titles of nobility. You cannot be a sir or lady something. Other distinctions in the Japanese language are in-group and out-group. So if you talk about your own brother, it's ani. If it's out-group, it's oni-san, right? So these translations from English to Spanish are very difficult for Japanese translators because they have to get a hold of who's older, who's younger, in-group, out-group, that kind of a thing, right? And just a couple of quotes. These are from Japanese students that I worked with. And the first was, the Japanese language itself separates the class or status level, like who I'm actually talking to. Even though I don't want to act differently, the language separates, so I have to act differently. When I speak to older people, I feel like I'm more polite because the language makes me be polite, politer than when I'm speaking to younger people. And another quote was, speaking English makes me feel like I can talk to anybody equally, even a professor or friends or younger kids. It's easier to interact with people language-wise. Because of the language, it makes me feel like I can talk to anyone. So I feel more open, more interactive, more aggressive with American people than Japanese. Okay, so you can see the difference between, flipping back and forth. You don't just flip from one language to the next. It's almost like you have to go through personality transformation, right? And this was just a quote that I found about egalitarianism in the US. On the other hand, on the Western frontier, there was more of a tendency for people to treat each other as social equals than in the more settled Eastern regions of the country. Hired helpers shared in the feeling of equality by refusing to be called servants or to be treated as such, right? American egalitarian is all about you're not better than I am, or as we see, you think you're better than me, right? Americans don't take kindly to the snob, right? In fact, the word snob, I think, is funny that in Spanish, they had to take it from English as if it didn't exist. The snob in Spanish is un snob, right? E-S-N-O-B, un snob, right? But in English, you have to watch your P's and Q's, especially if you're from a working class family like I am and you get a PhD. Oh my gosh, you have to, you don't want to use vocabulary, too many polysyllabic words or anything of that sort, right? Where people will think you think you're better than me, right? I'm going to stop for a minute before I talk about Chinese culture to see if anybody has any questions, and also not to be like Marco Rubio, but I need a sip of water. Any questions at this point?
I think you explained everything very well. I can fully understand the point. Yeah.
If you haven't objected yet, then if I talk about the Chinese, then you and Professor Tsai can just dig in, right, and contradict what I said here. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about Chinese, and I'm just going to talk about things that I have been involved with over a while. Okay, and first of all is the idea of toasting in Chinese, right? And I think Professor Liu saw a panel that I was part of a week ago, and there was a Chinese woman who said, I'm really uncomfortable with the fact that Americans will say, I love you, or they'll hug, or things like that, right? It's just not very common. And she's, I'm very embarrassed by that sort of thing. And I thought, well, I'll tell you what I'm embarrassed by in China, okay, is this propensity to toast someone and to look someone directly in the eye, right, as you toast them. I can do this with Chinese men. I can do it with Chinese women. I can do it with American women. I cannot do it with an American man, because when two American men lock eyes for any degree of time, especially two heterosexual American men, they have to either fight or kiss, okay? There's almost no in between. Try staring at your friends in the eye for a minute, right? And you're just going to crack up, right? An experiment that I tried when I was working in an office was, everybody remember Lumbergh from Office Space? Okay, we would try throughout the day to walk up to one another's desk and take a sip of coffee and stare the other guy in the eye like an alpha male. And none of us could complete sipping the coffee because we would just die laughing, because it's so uncomfortable for an American to stare into the eyes of an American man, to stare into the eyes of another American guy, right? But like I say, this is a common thing in China, right? You have your cup, you tap it on the table twice, and you look directly in that person's eye, and then you drink. Sometimes you stare into the person's eye as you drink. But I challenge any American guy to try that with another American guy and see how long you can do it, okay? All right, moving right along. Okay, there's some things about Chinese culture that might shock Americans. So I'm going to give you some heads up on these. The first one is planning, okay? Planning in China, planning in Japan, first of all, is just crazy. It's months in advance. You plan to plan, you have meetings to have meetings, and you get to a point where, as an American, I wanted to put a gun to my head because of all the careful planning. China could not be more different, right? You plan as you go. And a lot of people will say, well, you have to get something going before somebody stands in your way and tells you that you can't do it, right? So there's this idea of like, ready, go, and then put something together. Almost without, for example, I've seen people put together summer plans and then somebody says, what about insurance? Oh, well, we hadn't thought about that, right? There's just a whole lot of things that are put together very quickly. I'll give you a couple of examples. I remember being in Washington, D.C., and some of the representatives from China wanted to call up a restaurant and make reservations for 500 the following day. and they could not understand why every restaurant said, no, we can't do this on this short of notice, right? But in China, because maybe the large number of people and spaces, people can put things together in incredibly short periods of time, right? Another example is I was putting together a program for the summer service learning in 2009, and it was suddenly canceled because of the H1N1 virus. Rather than telling my students, well, it's canceled and you're going to lose your plane tickets and we can't go, I went to my Chinese vice director and I said, can we create our own summer service learning program for this summer? We have 2-3 weeks to do it. And he said, I think so. So he came to my office the next day, said, sir, we have a program. The next day, sir, we have no program. I said, but don't worry, I'll find it. Next day, sir, we have a program. Next day, sir, we don't have a program. So this went on and on until the day before the students were to leave. And I trusted in him fully. So he said, when you get to China, there will be a program. And sure enough, we got to China and everything went off. It was kind of put together at the last minute. He said, we have a backup. You can work at the university and so on and so forth. Okay. So this whole idea, this time frame of what can be done is a very different concept, especially for Americans. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries. There's temporal boundaries, right? Chinese often just call for meetings on the spur of the moment and everybody scurries together. It's amazing. It's easier to make a sudden meeting than it is to plan something in advance. In fact, I have a good friend who was working with the governor of Michigan, and he would try to create a plan. But if you say, can we meet this person, this vice president of your university in 1 month? Well, they freak out because I don't know what I'm going to have to do in 1 month. I might get called by somebody at a higher level. And so he would create this agenda and he would tell the governor that this is what he would do, but he knew that it would be subject to change, right? Because, for example, I had a colleague who told me that one day in his extreme example, she was a department chair. The vice director said, will you have lunch with me tomorrow? And she said, great. Then the dean asked the vice dean to have lunch. And so the vice dean canceled with the department chair. Well, soon the vice president of the university called the dean and said he wanted to have lunch with her. So she had to cancel lunch with the vice dean, right? And it went, so on and so forth. Now, this is probably hard for a lot of Chinese to understand, but if I have a meeting with a student at 3 p.m. and my boss calls me, I will not cancel that meeting to meet with the higher up, right? Because my emphasis is on respecting a person's time, regardless of where they are. Whereas in China, the respect goes toward the person's status, okay? So it's a very different way of looking at things. People within China understand, oh, you have to cancel a meeting, that's fine. Americans can get pretty upset. What, you canceled a meeting on me? What, you don't value my time? So it's a very different mindset. Physical boundaries. If I want to get a flash drive that I know I left in my Chinese colleague's office, I don't really have a problem just using my master key and going in and grabbing it, and that would be perfectly fine. If I did that with an American colleague, I would probably be sued, right? There would be an incredible invasion of privacy and so on and so forth. So things are just much more fluid in China, and there are a lot of these boundaries that Americans have set for themselves and for others, right? Emotional boundaries. I love this one, right? I would challenge Professor Liu and Professor Tsai to find some self-help books in Chinese that are basically about emotional boundaries, right? How to say no, how to set boundaries. This is as much as I'm going to do and no more, because in China, it would just be insulting, right? To say, you can't ask me to do this. When you're friends, you actually do things for one another. You actually ask favors. I think Americans are hesitant to ask for favors and often hesitant to do favors, right? But probably more hesitant to ask the favors, right? Paternalism, which I think is kind of interesting in terms of how bosses sometimes interact with their employees. In the idea of, for example, bringing a personal problem to a boss in America is, to me, unfathomable, right? I mean, we don't even ask anybody if they're married because that would be an infringement of their personal boundaries, right? So if I had a problem with my marriage or anything like that, it's the last person I would ever go to would be my boss, and the boss would find it really strange, right? Whereas in China, I think people are a little bit more fluid about, well, let me help you. I'm sort of, let me play that paternal role and help you through this so that you can be a better employee for me in the future. In essence, in America, we are parts of a car. We are readily changeable. I can take out a muffler, a carburetor, and replace it with another one on the spur of the moment. But I think the Chinese are more like parts of a body, right? I mean, you can't just take somebody's heart out very easily and replace it. You can do it, but it's difficult. And people have this iron rice bowl mentality left a lot of times, that they will be together regardless of conflict. Americans have a conflict. I'm not taking any of this. Take this job and, blank. I'm off, right? I'm leaving and finding another job. But the Chinese have this idea of working together, being together, working through the problems, working past the problems, right? You have a huge conflict with a coworker, you're still both going to be there for 20 years, right? So learn to deal with it. Another thing is sycophancy, right? The idea of, if my boss gives a good speech, I'm not likely to go up to him and say, wow, that was really, really riveting. I really appreciated what you said, because he'd be looking at me like, why are you sucking up? This is just not appropriate. Whereas in China, you'll have your students come up and say things like this, or people who work for you. Likewise, I think in China, you will send New Year's cards or so on to your higher ups. I might receive a Christmas card from my boss, but it would be a little bit sycophantic to be sending him cards or things like that. So there's just a very different way of the way people look at one another and how much they will compliment, maybe give face and things of that sort. That's all I have. If you're not tired of listening to me, then certainly my throat is dry and I'm tired of talking. So I'm going to end it right here. And I will take any questions that you have. And remember, Mienza is not a thing for me.